Dr. Eric Mosel is the Extension Cow-Calf Management Educator for the University of Minnesota. Eric organizes several statewide educational programs, including Cow-Calf Days, the Minnesota Grazing School, and the Northern Beef Roundup. He is a native of Nebraska and attended the University of Nebraska in Lincoln.
You guys ready? Can you see the screen?
Yep, it's still there.
Perfect. I thought maybe my screen had froze here and I just wasn't pushing the right button. So, all right. Well, I appreciate everybody joining this evening and all the work that the beef team has done to put this webinar together. It's been a good deal so far, and wanted to visit with you a little bit about calving season and really the effect that calving season has on our whole system. And I kind of like to think of it in terms of, you read in a lot of popular literature about the best calving season and this and that and the other. And I like to think of it in terms of trying to match our calving season to the resources that we have. And from that standpoint, we need to talk a little bit about the types of resources that we have available to us and kind of what that means in terms of, how we can fit that into make the most efficient system possible for what we're trying to do. And so when we think about the things that not only affect our calving season, but also that the calving season affects those things, where we're at here in, kind of the upper Midwest, obviously weather is one of the biggest issues that we have to deal with. So we're going to have to talk a little bit about that. Anytime you talk about calving cows, we're going to have to think about labor and facilities. And, probably one of the more important things, because it's the biggest cost in the cow-calf system that we have to deal with, is when we start thinking about feed costs and the amount of feed that's required and those types of things. We'll look at some things concerning calf health problems, particularly as they relate to calving season. We're going to talk a little bit about weaning weights and market prices at weaning and that type of thing. And then, from an efficiency standpoint, we need to look at pregnancy percentage. And then, we also need to think about in terms of labor and how that affects other enterprises that we're involved with on our farms and ranches. So, I want to talk a little bit about weather, and this is not going to be a real surprise to anybody, but when we think about this in terms of our calving season, we want to think of this in terms of wherever you go in the country, let alone in Minnesota, you've got it's going to be either cold or it's going to be warm. And I don't like to use the word hot in Minnesota because it never gets very hot here. But we need to look at, when we think about the issues that we have at the time of the year when it's cold as it relates to calving, we're going to have things like cold stress. We're going to need a set of facilities that allow us to handle that type of weather. We're going to have to think about bedding and nutrition and, and there's a whole litany of things that we need to think about there. That obviously is just a few. And then on the other side, of course, when we think about warm weather and calving, well, now, maybe we've got to start thinking about things like flies and those types of things. We may have to be concerned about dust, heat stress in some cases, and things like that. But the big thing that makes, in my opinion, that makes Minnesota a little bit different than a lot of other places is the interaction between these temperature extremes and the amount of moisture that we get. And now, whether we're talking about rainfall or humidity, we're going to be thinking about things like mud and the bedding and the facility requirements that we're going to need to have to deal with mud. And of course, anytime that you add wet to any type of calving system, we're going to have increased incidence of bacteria, viruses, parasites, those types of things. And so, really what we need to think about it is you can't get away from either cold or warm or wet in Minnesota. It's going to be one or all of those things. And so what we're trying to do is minimize the interaction between moisture and these temperature extremes. And that's going to have a big impact on how our calving season interacts with a lot of these different factors that we're going to be talking about. The thing I had on there about labor, that's any real quality information on labor in a cow-calf system is a little bit hard to come by, particularly, interestingly enough, as it relates to calving. But I did find a little bit of data that I thought was pretty interesting, and this comes out of South Dakota, and it's pretty old, but for the topic, I don't know that it matters all that much. But when we look at the total hours that we spend at calving in these different calving seasons, and we're going to talk about how we break this up into kind of winter, late winter type calving, early spring, late spring, early summer, and then as we get into late summer and early fall. And you can see if you look on the right hand side of this graph here that there is a little bit of a difference in the amount of time that is spent in different types of calving seasons, which is not going to be a real surprise to anyone. But what did strike me a little bit is you think about the quantity of time that we see in terms of the difference between these different seasons. I was a little bit surprised at. And that for pretty much everyone, time for all of us is at a premium. And so when we think about not only the time that we spent, but the amount of quality time that we have to spend with the cows during calving is going to have a big impact on the results that we see. And so, that when we think about different calving seasons, that's certainly something that we want to take into consideration is the labor requirements of different seasons. Oops, let's see. All right, and then now we could obviously have a whole presentation on facilities, and so I'm just going to kind of hit the perimeter of the thing here a little bit, because what we're really just talking about here is thinking about at different times of the year, what types of facilities are going to be necessary to get the results that we would like to see out of a particular calving season. All right. And so, on the left side, where we're kind of in that winter, early spring, time frame, well, we're going to have to be thinking about things like barns and windbreaks and calf shelters and bedding for snow and mud, and do you have the room to spread them out? And probably pretty much everybody on this presentation has heard me beat the drum about getting cows spread out, particularly in the winter and early spring calving seasons to reduce calf scours and those types of things. And so those are again, that's just a small list of the many things during that season that we need to think about in terms of facilities. Now, if you go over to the right and we think about more of a kind of a late summer, early fall type calving season, well, one of the first things we're going to have to think about, well, where exactly are we going to calve these cows out? For the most part, a lot of them are probably still out on grass. Are we actually going to try and calve them out on pasture, or are we going to bring them in, or are we going to kind of do a hybrid where part of them are in and part of them are, how exactly is that going to work? That's kind of what we got to get figured out. And there's always the potential for pretty significant mud, maybe not like we see in the spring, obviously, but we do tend to get a lot of rain in a normal year as we move towards fall, and that's something that we're going to have to take into consideration. And then, one of the things that I think is important to really think about in terms of facilities in the fall is, one of the biggest issues obviously is when we have these, as we move towards fall, we start getting these very large daily temperature swings between day and night, and we saw a lot of that last week where we were, 70, 75 degrees during the day. And then at least up here, we were down in the teens at night. And that's really, really hard, even on a weaned calf, let alone a brand new baby. So we're gonna have to think about how we're gonna deal with that. Okay. So then we move kind of back into the summertime. And whether that's June or July or the last part of May or however that works out, the biggest thing we're going to think about is maybe on the whole our facility requirements are going to be less, but again we have to go back to this question, well, where exactly are we going to calve these cows out? Now if you have a lot of grass right around the house and the barns and that type of thing, well, okay, that's not that big a deal, but you don't see the prevalence of that in Minnesota like you might as you move further west. And so how realistic is it that you're going to be able to calve cows out on pasture? So, maybe it takes less facilities and it takes less time in theory, but the reality is that unless you have either facilities where the cows are at, if there's problems or those types of things, or you have grass right around your current facility that can hold them for whatever the duration of your calving season is, then that's probably one of the biggest things that you have to get figured out for summer. And the reality is at least from what I've seen in Minnesota, that's what limits a lot of people from summer calving, is they just simply don't have the resources to work around that problem. And so that, those are some of the things that we're going to have to consider in terms of facilities. Now, of course, we talked about on the front end in terms of nutrition. Nutrition, obviously, it kind of goes without saying, but nutrition is one of the key things to a successful calving season, not only going into calving, but once those cows start milking, making sure that they have the groceries that they need to milk adequately and prepare to rebreed. And 90% of us on this webinar right now are probably fairly familiar with the nutrient curve in a spring calving system. And on the screen, you can see it there in the green. And so let's say this is a March calving herd. We're going to hit that peak milk production about 30 days later in April. And, those nutrients are going to start, the nutrient requirements are going to start tailing off a little bit as you go through the summer. Those calves get bigger, they get more independent. The cows don't need to milk as much, so on and so forth. And then, maybe it's not represented quite accurately on this particular graph, but, basically at some point, you get to September, October, whatever it ends up being, you wean those calves off. And then of course the cows dry up and nutrient requirements drop significantly for a period of time before they start rising again as we enter the second trimester of gestation. All right. So, most of us are fairly familiar with that. And we're just going to take that exact same green line, and if we're talking more about a summer type system, we're just going to slide it, a little bit to the right to wherever, it fits into that deal. And you've kind of got the same scenario. But, obviously a fall calving system is going to be like the inverse of that. And so you're going to hit your peak nutrient requirements, kind of going into winter. It's going to be sometime around October, November, something like that. And then you're going to go, through the rest of the winter into early spring at some of the highest nutrient requirements, but they are tailing off as you get, closer to spring. And then, somewhere in March or April or late February, wherever it ends up being in your deal, the calves are going to be weaned off, nutrient requirements are going to drop, and the process starts over. And so the point of this whole thing is you really got to think about, okay, well, based on when these cows are calving and when their nutrient requirements are going to be the highest, what does my feed situation look like at that time of the year? Not just in terms of the quantity and the quality, but also the cost of feeding those cows during that time of higher nutrient requirements. And obviously every scenario is going to be just a little bit different, but you know, as we think about a spring calving system, we've got a couple of months of pretty high nutrient requirements where we really have to pour the groceries to these cows. And a lot of that's going to be harvested, you know, winter feed. As you look at more of a summer type system, of course, if you can get around the calving on pasture, you know, those cows are out on grass at their highest nutrient requirements. And so that's relatively simple to address. And then of course, in a fall calving system, they're hitting, you know, peak milk production right at the time when you got to start feeding them winter roughage, and then you got to feed them over the whole winter at relatively high nutrient requirements. So, you know, basically in a spring and a fall type system, if you've got relatively reasonably priced feedstuffs, then, you know, maybe that's something you can overcome. But if you've got a really high feed cost to begin with, some of those systems might not be real conducive to, you know, controlling feed costs from that standpoint. And then, of course, you know, we kind of glossed over it, but of course, amount and quality are also important, and we have to make sure that we're addressing the needs of the cow at the time that she needs it in order to get the results that we want. And part of that goes into this next slide, is just making sure that we understand not only do nutrient requirements increase after calving, or well, really going into calving, and then after they calve, obviously, once they start milking, but the amount that they're going to eat also plays into that. And so you can see just from this graph, and this would just kind of, it's not specific to any particular season. If you see there at the bottom, it's just months after calving. So whether that's March or August, it doesn't really matter. You're going to see this same type of curve where intake is going to go from about 2% dry matter based on body weight, and it can go in excess of 2.5. And if it's really cold out, it may even go as high as 3%. And I know, you know, pretty much everybody has experienced that, but if you want to just a visual of how much that intake really increases, that's kind of what it looks like. And so not only when we hit peak milk production, she's eating more groceries, she needs higher quality groceries, but then at certain times of the year, if that lactation is taking place when it's really cold out, then you're going to need more on top of that just to maintain the cow, maintain that milk production so she can feed that cow. Okay, and then of course, if you look at feed costs, now the interesting thing is looking at any type of production data by calving date is really, really hard to come by, that type of actual data. And so you can see that I did this study when I was in South Dakota, and it's a little bit dated now, and you probably noticed that when you looked at some of the numbers here, but we're not so concerned about the amount of the numbers. We're just looking at the relationships between the different calving dates. And we'll talk as we go through the rest of the evening here. We'll talk about the rest of this the data in this graph. But for right now, we're just going to look at cow feed cost and total cost per cow as it relates to calving date. And you can see there's a pretty significant difference in terms of the 4 different calving dates that we looked at in this particular study. You know, particularly as you look, you know, from kind of a late winter and fall type calving system compared to a you know, a late spring or summer type system. Pretty significant difference there, and a lot of that is simply, you know, based on what we just talked about in terms of meeting the needs of those cows at certain times of the year. And of course, that's going to play into total cow costs as well. It would be nice if we still had cow costs that were $400 or $500. Of course, that's not the case today. But again, we're really just looking at the relationships between the different calving seasons, and we can see there's a pretty significant difference there. How relevant is this to Minnesota? Well, obviously, Western Minnesota, I would suspect this data is quite relevant. As you move further east, you could see some differences just simply based on feed availability, quality, weather patterns, those types of things. And we'll get into that here in just a little bit. Hang on just a second here. Guys, there's this bar across the top of the screen. How do I shut that off?
The green one, and you only have one screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so you can't turn it off, but you can grab it. It will have like 4 arrows, and you can move it down to the bottom of your screen, if that's helpful.
There, that is exactly what I needed. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so again, we're going to make some speculations here, and I want to be clear that there is really no data that exists on relating the incidence of calf health problems or the type of calf health problems and relating it back to a specific calving season or time of the year. So we're doing a little bit of speculating here just based on some of this data that we're pulling out of this South Dakota study. So I guess what I'm saying is kind of take it with a grain of salt, but I'm fairly comfortable with making some of these speculations just in terms of the accuracy. And what I'm really talking about here is taking a look at weaning percentage. And look at the difference in weaning percentage. Now, of course, again, this is South Dakota, but we look at the difference in weaning percentage based on different calving dates. Now, there was nothing in this study that strictly assessed data that would suggest that the cause of lower weaning percentage was, in fact, calf health problems. But on the other hand, common sense would say, well, what else would it be? Okay, so that's why I say a little bit of this you got to take with a grain of salt. But again, I'm pretty comfortable making the statement that we do see pretty significant differences in weaning percentage. And I would suggest that a lot of those differences are based on the calf health problems that we see based on the time of year that we calve. And so, 88, 89% weaning percentage in South Dakota is fairly low. You would typically think of seeing something on average more like in the low to mid 90s. And so when you start splitting it out, you start to see that, well, okay, there's certain times of the year where weaning percentages, calving at certain times of the year, we see quite a bit higher weaning percentages, but then other times of the year, we see them drop off pretty significantly, 5, 6, 7 points. And we'll talk about here in just a minute that's a pretty significant drop in weaning percentage. And again, everybody on here has heard me just beat to death weaning percentage, but that is the main profitability driver in cow-calf operations. If we can't get a handle on getting calves, a live calf to the sale barn, then that's probably the biggest thing that we need to focus on. And so, weaning percentage or death loss in calves, I guess, however you want to look at it, is the largest non-feed expense for Minnesota cow-calf herds by far and away. And you look at the Minnesota 5-year average for weaning percentage, right around 85, 86%, somewhere in there. And if you do some rough cowboy math on that, you're roughly that cost per cow is, just a little bit under $150 a cow, because the cows that do have a calf have got to pay for all the costs that went into the cows that ended up not being able to carry a calf all the way, to the sale barn. And so those costs have to go somewhere. And so they have to be picked up by the other calves that did make it to the sale barn. And like I say, that's somewhere, $140, $150. You compare that to the region, and of course, and by region, I'm talking like the Eastern Dakotas. I try and sort out the Western portions of the rectangle states because, obviously that's an entirely different environment than what we're talking about. But you look at Iowa, Eastern Nebraska, the Eastern Dakotas, somewhere around, 92, 93% is a pretty typical weaning percentage. There's a cost with that as well, but it's quite a bit less than where we're at. And as many of you, have heard me talk about, it's so much of this is management based. It's based on the fact that we have really crappy weather in Minnesota. Again, referring to the very first slide, not just too hot or too cold, but just the amount of moisture that we get really amplifies whatever issues kind of already exist. And so, the point being that, we really got to get a handle on weaning percentage. And if you've been to cow-calf days, we've talked about how not everybody, but some of us could really stand to reconsider the time of the year that we wean calves in an effort to be able to get more calves to the weaning pen, because losing 15% of your calf crop on average, it's pretty tough to make any money in the cow-calf business. And that is going to be a problem as we move forward. It's going to be hard to keep cows in Minnesota if guys can't make any money doing it. Okay, just a little bit on weaning weights. Again, this is out of that same data set, looking at the different calving dates. If you go over to average weaning weight, you can see the differences there. One thing I found kind of interesting as we collected this data is your raw weaning averages don't have a very standardized days to weaning. And so what you're looking at in terms of the average weaning weight is the raw weaning weight that folks reported for this particular study. So the data that we collected was just their raw weaning weights, okay? And so we did a few little calculations here just to standardize that a little bit. And so we calculated weight per day of age. And then over on the far right, we corrected those raw weaning weights to 205-day weights, just so we were comparing apples to apples in that particular situation. And so you can look at that. You can see there's some differences there. Again, part of that is the weaning weight, but then obviously when you start looking at pounds of calf weaned per cow exposed, there's a portion of that efficiency that relates back to weaning percentage. And of course, we don't sell raw weaning weight, we sell pounds of calf weaned per cow exposed. And so that's really the efficiency factor that we want to shoot for. Okay, so anytime you have a discussion about calving dates, particularly in popular press, media, and those types of things, there's a lot of discussion on market prices at the time of weaning for different calving seasons. All right. And so I thought it would probably be used. I don't think it's really that big of an issue, but I thought it would be useful just to talk through this with you and look at, this is a representation of cash feeder calves that weighed 550 pounds at Motley from 2015 through thus far in 2022. Okay. And so really the point here is looking at, based on whenever you calve or potentially could calve, what time of the year would you be marketing those calves? All right. And so obviously you don't have to market them right at 205 days of age, which is why I think maybe the discussion on market prices and calving seasons is maybe not all that important, because you've got a couple things going on. You can obviously wait longer to wean the calves or wean them early, or so many guys now have the ability to hold those calves and precondition them and background them. And so, maybe this is a big deal in a situation where you really have no option but to market calves right off the cow. Then yeah, it's going to make a little bit of a difference when you calve, in terms of when those calves are going to be ready to market. But beyond that, I'm not sure it's that big of a deal. But you could see, obviously, there's a little bit of seasonal difference in prices in the marketplace, and it's pretty consistent from year to year. You're going to see your highest calf prices as you're kind of going into August, September. As the big fall run starts, you're going to see them start to, the barns are going to start getting flooded with calves. Buyers can be a little pickier. They don't need to bid as aggressively, so on and so forth. And you'll see the prices drop a little bit. And some years it's a little more than others, and that type of thing. And then, as we start getting into the latter half of December, I would say those prices kind of start to rebound as we go to the new year. And then at least the last 4 or 5 years, we've kind of seen a little bit of a dip again in February. And then it rebounds going into March. And then it's just, fairly level to, maybe picking up a little bit of strength as we move back into August. And so that's your pretty typical seasonal price curve on calves. And you can see there that, your March calves at 205 days, that's going to be somewhere around October. A May calf is going to be somewhere around December, and then an August calf is going to be somewhere around March. And so, if you're in a situation where you're going to be forced to market calves in October and November, well, the seasonal calf market is going to work against you a little bit. But again, there's a lot of ways around that. So I don't know that really should be the driving. If you're thinking about when should I calve cows, or you're thinking about maybe I should change my calving season, I don't know that I would really let this be one of the main drivers, And the other thing, of course, which we kind of get into on the next slide, I think, well, no. So also we have to keep in mind what size of calf that we're marketing based on different calving seasons. So, your March calf in October, at least in Minnesota, on average is going to be in the mid 500s. That's pretty decent sized calf. But when we get in, and you're going to probably be in a little bit similar situation with an August type calf, marketing it in March, it's going to be, somewhere in the mid 500s. Your May calves might be a little bit back from that because they're going to be a little bit younger, and they just tend to I don't know, it just seems like sometimes your summer calves they grow aggressively, but they by the time you get to a May calf, our data would show, if you look at the previous slides, that you do tend to market a little bit lighter calf out of a summer calving deal. And whether they're a little bit lighter or whatever the situation might be, that's something we do have to take into consideration. And so it's tempting to look at, well, if I'm marketing a 400-pound calf, I'm getting 10 cents more a pound than a 500-pound calf, but you're also marketing less pounds. So that's something we have to be a little bit wary of course, is not getting too wrapped up in gross returns, and keeping in mind that gross is just one side of the equation. We've also got to think of, based on, when these calves are on the ground and growing, what are our expenses going into those calves, and how does that affect our net coming out the other side? Okay, so one thing that I think we do see more of than maybe we would probably admit, and there is a little bit of data to support the assumptions, the observations, whatever you want to call them, is that, I think calving season does have an impact on pregnancy percentage as those cows rebreed. But for a variety of different reasons. Okay, so this is some data out of Nebraska. This is really high quality data done by some really high quality scientists. And so, what they're seeing, both in eastern and western Nebraska, is a situation where you're seeing pregnancy percentage in June and September calving cows a little bit lower, well, in their case, quite a bit lower than you might see in some early spring calving cows. And what they attribute it to, and I would agree with their assumptions, is that, well, if you're calving in June, then you're breeding in September, or if you're calving in September, you're breeding in December. Now, recognize in Nebraska, those cows are still out on grass. And so if you think about the quantity and the quality of grass on some of those ranges out in that country, you can start to kind of formulate in your mind why you might see some lower preg percentages. All right. So what I thought would be important would be just to relate it back to that previous. Again, we don't have any actual data on this for Minnesota itself, but if you look at that study that we did in South Dakota, you actually do see a fairly similar trend. Now, the difference in it's maybe not as pronounced as we see in Nebraska, and that would make a lot of sense because it's really probably in Minnesota, it's really not quality that's the limiter as you look at a June or a kind of a fall type calving system. It's going to be quantity. And so if you're breeding in a September, so like in a June calving, May-June calving system, you're going to be breeding in August, September-ish. And we all know what pastures in Minnesota look like at that time of the year. And so unless they're getting some supplemental feed, those cows, they may be in pretty good shape, but they are on a declining plane of nutrition, and that rarely works out well for pregnancy percentage. And you can make the same speculations with an August, September type calving season where you're breeding in, November, December-ish. Maybe those cows are out on stalks, whatever the situation might be. Even if they're in pretty good condition, they are on a declining plane of nutrition. Day length is getting shorter. The body is telling that cow, this is not a great time to get pregnant. Because the next several months are not going to be really ideal in terms of feed quality, quantity, weather, those types of things. And that's a very normal biological response that we see in a lot of mammals. And so it's, I guess, really once you start thinking about it, it's really not that big of a surprise that we see that. So in any case, that is something to some degree, as you think about if you're thinking about moving your calving season or you're kind of new to the deal, it's something to take into consideration. Again, not nearly as pronounced as they typically see in some of the Western ranges. And so I don't know that this would really be one of my principal concerns with a particular calving season, but certainly something I want to keep in mind. All right, so just to summarize a little bit, because that was a kind of a mass of stuff that we went through. And so I just kind of wanted to run through of those factors, and that's not every factor you could possibly think about in terms of the effect of calving season on different parameters in your cow-calf deal, but I think those are some of the more important ones. And so we think about advantages, disadvantages, or if a particular thing is kind of neutral. So when we think about late winter and early spring type calving systems, the things we'll have going for us is higher weaning weights for sure, better preg percentage probably. And, for a lot of us, the big advantage and the reason that a lot of folks calve at this time of the year is it doesn't interfere with farming. And that's a legitimate deal. And so that's something we're going to have to take into consideration. The disadvantages of that time of the year, of course, are going to be weather. It's going to generally take more labor. Going to have more facilities. It's going to take more feed. It probably cost more to some degree. And the potential is higher for calf health problems. And then, of course, like I kind of alluded to, I don't know, I think the market price thing is kind of a neutral item when it comes to selecting your calving season or considering moving your calving season, unless, of course, like I said, you're locked into selling calves right off the cow. Then maybe it's a little bit bigger deal. We think about late spring and early summer. Again, the advantages, you know, the weather's going to be better or at least less erratic. It's not that we can't have bad weather at that time of the year, but I think it tends to be less erratic. It generally takes less labor, less facilities, less feed for the most part, and the potential for calf health problems seems to be a little bit less, keeping in mind that it's really tough to get any actual data on that. But it's, you know, observationally, it would seem that you have less calf health problems in that time frame. And then, you know, the disadvantages, of course, is potentially you might have a little bit lower weaning weights. You potentially could have a little bit lower breed back. There obviously is going to be a lot more interference with trying to farm in terms of labor. And then to some degree, depending on what time you're looking at, if it's a June, July type deal, then we're going to need to worry about flies and maybe to a small degree, some heat stress and those types of things. And again, market prices being, at least in my mind, kind of neutral. And then, you know, late summer, early fall type deal, you know, usually pretty good weather. It generally takes less labor, less facilities. You're going to get a little higher weaning weights. And again, you know, again, depending on how you laid it out or what your farming scenario is, it generally less interference with farming. You know, harvest will be starting up, but usually you can get them calved out before then, or at least the majority of them. And then, of course, the disadvantages, potentially a little bit lower preg percentage, usually takes more feed for a fall calving deal. Calf health problems, you know, can go either way. If we have a fall like this year, probably didn't have a lot of problems. Some years when we get a lot of rain in the fall, you can see some outbreaks of some pretty nasty stuff. And then again, you know, again, depending on the weather, it could be a parasite type situation in terms of flies and other types of things. But, and again, market prices being generally neutral. So, you know, by and large, like I say, if you thinking about different types of calving seasons, moving your calving season for a particular reason, you know, those types of things, those are the main things I think I would really take into consideration as I thought about what works best for my particular situation. And what I do not want to, you know, try and convey here is that one calving season is better than the other, because it's not. It is entirely based on the resources that you have at your disposal and how to use them most efficiently to get the calving result that you want. And that's really all it boils down to. And so, you know, I don't think that that I necessarily think one time of year is better to calve in than the other. I don't. I've seen all of them work. I've seen all of them be a disaster in the wrong, you know, in the wrong situation. And so it's really about taking a look at these things that we talked about and figuring out, okay, well, how can I most efficiently use these resources to get the results that I want? And with that, I appreciate everybody's time. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to visit about those.
All right, so we do have some questions. We'll let you keep your slide up for a little bit so people can grab your contact information, but then we'll go ahead and take that down. So the first one that we want to start with are, what are your suggestions and best practices to reduce or avoid fly strikes on newborn calves that are born in the late summer?
Well, I think, you know, a lot of that is going to be predetermined by how well the fly control program is going into summer on the entire cow herd, and using the appropriate tools that are available to limit flies on the cow. And that obviously to some degree will translate to the calf. Now, if you're running an outfit where you've got the time and the resources to use, things like, face covers and things like that, those things work and they're fine. The cow's probably just going to lick them off, but if you got the time to deal with it, those things can help. But I really think a lot of it is, first thing in the summer, as you turn cows out, is make sure your fly control program is up to snuff and is working properly to get those kinds of results.
All right. So on one slide, you had a ration intake curve. Is that the same intake curve when they are pregnant?
Yeah, so that more or less showed the year-round intake curve. And so what you typically see, once you've hit that peak lactation, like we talked about, you'll see a pretty big jump in intake, and then it's going to start tailing off both. And, let's think in terms of a spring type system, because that's what most of us are used to. So we think about a spring type system. So we're seeing some intake increase just simply from the fact that she's lactating, and then some of that is because it's it can still be fairly cold out. Pretty much anything under 20 degrees is going to cause an increase in nutrient requirements and intake. And so depending on where you're at in the state, you can go quite a ways into the spring and still be under 20 degrees, at least at night. And so that's what precipitates that biologically. And then, as it warms up and the lactation requirements become less, we see intake start to drop back a little bit. And, 2% is about the baseline, and that's about where she returns to by, end of the summer. She might fall well below that for a brief period of time once you wean that calf off. But as you enter that second trimester stage of gestation, then you're going to start to see both the nutrient requirements of that cow pick up as well as the intake. It's not dramatic, but it does just, it inches up. And, by the time she's to the third trimester or just before calving, she's probably already at 2.25% of her body weight in dry matter intake. And then it'll jump from there again, obviously, once she calves and hits peak lactation.
All right. So at one point you had a 5-year average for Minnesota. What is the source of that Minnesota and regional data? Did that come from FinPac or someplace else?
5-year average of what?
It was on one of your slides.
Well, there were several.
Okay.
One of them was prices. One of them was weaning percentage. One of them was something else.
It was the weaning percentage, Eric.
Okay.
So what was those?
Well, then the guy who asked the question said the cost of calf care.
Cost of calf care. Well, I guess I'm not sure exactly what he's talking about, but what I can tell you is any financial data specifically for Minnesota comes from the either the FinBin database or from the Ridgewater Ag Business Program.
Okay. All right, our next question. Some producers sell calves directly off the cows without putting time and effort into weaning. Could you share the pros and cons of that strategy?
Well, yeah, there are a number of guys that do that. And in some scenarios, that works just fine. Particularly if you have a buyer that wants them right off the cow, and those folks do exist. And I think this is just observationally, but I do think you're seeing a few more buyers that like those calves right off the cow because there are less they feel they feel that there are less opportunities for us lowlings to screw them up before they get their hands on them, because they're going to revaccinate them anyway. They're going to, start them on how they want them started. And so they're like, it's just easiest just to get them right off the cow and do that. All right. So if that situation is prearranged, that can very much work in your benefit. However, that is probably still a minority view. And most buyers are interested in calves that are, of course, vaccinated, cut, weaned, preconditioned, blah, 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 blah. The issue, I think, is you have seen in the last, I don't know, 3 to 5 years, it used to be 30 days weaned. That's what they wanted. And then it was 45. And then it was, 45 plus. And then now they want them 60 days weaned. So obviously somebody somewhere is buying enough calves and they're like, we're getting these calves 45-day weans and they're showing up at our feed yard and they're still getting sick. And so they're willing to, or they would like to see those calves weaned a little bit longer. And so that's really what it boils down to is buyers at somewhere are getting calves out of the barn. And even if they're weaned, 45 days, they're still getting some outbreaks. And so they want to keep extending that. And so to address the question directly, unweaned calves without some arrangement from somebody that wants them weaned right off the cow is probably not going to be real beneficial in the long run. Right now, if you just, you watch the Motley sale, it's about a $15 discount right now if they're unweaned. And so I think, if you're in a situation where you need to wean those calves right off the cow and get them gone, then put some time and effort into finding somebody that wants them in that type of arrangement, and possibly work with some neighbors that are in that type of that are in that same situation, so you can get a quantity to present to somebody that wants them unweaned, just right off the cow.
All right, we have one final evaluation poll, and we'd like to know if the information shared was beneficial to all of you joining us tonight.
And right as you started saying that, we got another question. So
all right, go ahead and answer that one too.
Last question while you guys are answering the poll is, some of the interest in the unweaned calves have more to do with the feeding program that they are started on rather than the vaccination program. There seems to be some pretty solid standardized vaccination type protocols.
Was that a question or a statement?
That was a question. So they're wondering if the interest in the unweaned calves has more to do with feeding programs than vaccination programs.
Oh, I think the interest is more on the feed side, by far and away. It gives the guys that want those calves have a specific way that they want to start those calves on feed. And great if they're vaccinated, fine if they're not, because they're just going to revaccinate them anyway. But I think what really precipitates that is whatever their feed program is, that's what they want going into those calves from day one post weaning.
All right, thank you. We appreciate all of those answers. Those are all the questions we have at this time, Katie.
All right. So we want to just thank you for attending the second session of the U of M Extension's Essentials for Cattle Owner with a Day Job webinar on choosing a calving season. This presentation has been recorded and all registrants will receive a link to the recording from tonight's presentation at the conclusion of the webinar series. Just a reminder that our next webinar will be next week on Thursday, November 17th, starting at 8 p.m. and will be about winter housing considerations such as space requirements, feeding strategies, and spring scours. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again on Thursday.
All right, Joe is just typing out an answer for a last question that came in, and that one is taken care of. So we are good to go. Thank you, everyone.
Sorry, I just said we'd answer it after Katie was
Oh.
done talking.
Sorry.
All good. So the question was, just so everyone knows,
My sales barn rep suggested that I add Somnus to my vaccination protocol because the buyers want that. Why is this so?
So I would say that's not particularly true across the board. The bug we're talking about is Cystophilus somnus, which is a respiratory pathogen, a bacterial pathogen. And it really depends on the buyer. So if that feed yard has a history of dealing with that issue, they might want it. But the research will tell you that that vaccine is outdated. It has questionable efficacy based on how much that bug has changed since the original vaccines came out. So I would, if I'm going to the sale barn, I would not make that a priority. If I'm going directly to a feed yard that has a specific issue with that and asks for it, then yes, absolutely make it a priority. But for me, I would take that recommendation with heavy skepticism.
Joe, is Somnus one of the key components of shipping fever?
So yes, yeah, BRD has a lot of different components, but most of our components are viral. So there's two camps out there, right? But I think there's the most evidence for basically our viruses starting everything and all of our bacteria being secondary issues. So if you can stop the viruses, you can stop the bacterial issues from happening. Now, Somnus can be a little different, especially because it has several different forms. Sometimes it attacks the brain, sometimes it attacks lungs, sometimes it actually attacks the heart. So it depends on which form you're seeing and what all those different things, but a lot of times it takes a bunch of different times of seeing that vaccine before it actually has some efficacy. So I'm not convinced that should be a priority if you're selling calves. That's something that the feed yard can decide is a priority for them, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I wasn't questioning your recommendation. I mean,
yeah,
you're the vet, but I was wondering, a lot of times I think they recommend that for, the old cattle buyer terminology is still shipping fever.
Right.
And I was wondering, because I thought Somnus was a part of that complex, and so that's what I was asking.
Yeah. So there's two we think of, and they've changed names a lot too. So that can be adding to all of the different names that float around too. So right now it's called Mannheimia hemolytica, and that used to be Pasteurella hemolytica, and that's had a bunch of different names. So that's part of BRD as well. But again, most of it I think is viral. But Cystophilus, it's a bad bug. The problem is that we just don't have a great vaccine for it right now. Someone commented, Leadstone told me that Somnus is hard on calves when you give it. That can be true. It can be a pretty harsh vaccine. We just got to follow all the same rules that we do with any other vaccines in how we stack vaccines and which ones we give at the same time. So again, that's something to work out with your veterinarian, but I would not prioritize that vaccine. And I'd focus more on management and giving healthy calves short travel distances, making them low risk in every other way.
All right. Well, thank you all for the questions. We really appreciate you being here tonight.